Welcome to the Oncology Speaker Series. Today's talk is about oncology genetics, indications for considering genetic testing, as well as applications for the information. I'd like to spend just a minute to start us off by introducing myself. I'm Lydia Higgs, and I am a certified genetic counselor. I've worked here in Carilion Clinic's Oncology Genetics program since 2017. And every year, I see up to 400 patients who are considering genetic testing and genetic risk assessment for cancer. In addition to my role in the clinical setting, I am also an instructor faculty member at Virginia Tech Carilion School of Medicine. I'm a past president of the Virginia Association of Genetic Counselors, and I volunteer regularly with organizations such as the National Society of Genetic Counselors. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. First, I have no financial conflicts to disclose today. Any opinions that I share with you represent my own thoughts. They do not represent the organizations of which I am a member. I do want to give content credit to a few folks. This presentation was modified from content that was originally released through the NSGC. Thank you so much to Andrea Foreman and Mary Freevogel. As always, this information is for educational purposes. It can't substitute for any type of conversation you'll have with a medical professional. So if today's talk sparks your interest or it raises the question of whether this might be information that applies to you, please reach out to one of your healthcare providers or a genetic counselor. I'll provide information at the end of today's talk with resources for how you can reach out to a genetic counselor near you. So let's dive in, oncology genetics. Here is a list that represents several common diseases here in the US. Cancers, heart disease, diabetes, arthritis, osteoporosis. And for almost every disease that we can think of, if you stop and ask your doctor, what are the main risk factors? You're going to get very similar answers over and over. You'll hear things such as this list. The items circled in green represent items that we have some control over. These are the factors that appear in study after study. And believe it or not, an overall healthy lifestyle will lead to a healthier life. It can't guarantee that disease will never happen, though. In general, regular exercise, diets that are based around fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and lean proteins, as well as limiting our alcohol use and avoiding smoking, can provide great benefit. We all know this, and we'll do our best to varying degrees of success. But the items that are circled above in pink are the factors that we don't have as much control over. After all, we don't get to choose whether we grow older, and we didn't get to pick out our family histories. Genetics itself has been a field of great interest, and we have been learning about the genetic influence on life and on disease for a very long time. It continues to fascinate the scientific world, but it's also held an interest for the general public. You can see in this image, Time magazine has continued to share with us cover stories over and over again about the advances in genetics, about the advances of genetics in medicine, and about the potential uses of genetics in the future, even if at times they sound a little like sci-fi. You probably guessed too before you logged on today that we might have had to have just a little biology lesson. Now, if you're in the audience and you have got science or medical background, you'll be very familiar with this. But for lots of us, it's been a really long time since we talked about biology or genetics. So please bear with me for just a minute or two. As a reminder, our body is made up of billions of cells. Skin cells, heart cells, eye cells, muscle cells, and within the center of every cell are structures that are called chromosomes. Chromosomes are little packages and often are shaped like X's. They are made of very, very long strands of DNA. And I want you to think about your DNA like being a book of recipes. Individual sections of the DNA make up individual genes. And we've got about 20,000 genes. Every gene represents a recipe. And within that recipe, we have the instructions to build individual proteins. And proteins are what go out into the cells to help our cells to do their work. So at the root of it, our genes are the instructions. They determine things like our eye color and our hair color. But because they're building proteins that go out and do work in the cell, they're also controlling how our cells function, how they live, but also how they die. They also interact with all of our environmental influences. Now, when we're born, our genes are as good as they're ever going to be. No one is genetically perfect, that's just not possible. But at day one, they're functioning as well as they ever will. And aging begins right away. As time passes, our DNA has the potential to accumulate damage. And damage can influence how that process occurs. As damage accumulates, it can lead to disease and even cancers. And when we study cancer specifically, you'll see a lot of those same risk factors we talked about at the beginning. Things like our lifestyle, things like aging can influence our risk. But we also know that to some extent, genetics can influence our risk of cancer as well. Only about 10% of the time, though, are cancers related to inherited genetic risk. This means that a person inherited a single genetic difference that means their gene does not work properly, and it has raised their risk to develop certain types of cancers. These types of inherited cancer risks can be passed down throughout the family from either mom or dad, similar to how eye color or hair color can be passed along from generation to generation. But we see that the biggest category for cancers are those that are sporadic, the ones that happen as a result of accumulated damage that we can't regulate or control, the things that happen just because we're here every day. So the question has to be, how do we figure out who is most likely to have hereditary cancer compared to one of the cancers that are not considered hereditary? And to answer that question, we look for 4 specific clues. When we think about our histories, our parents, our brothers and sisters, our grandparents, we want to look for the things that make us more suspicious that a hereditary cancer might be present. Those clues can include diagnoses that happened at younger than average ages. That might be something like breast cancer happening at or before age 45, or colon cancers that happened before age 50. We also look to see, were there rare cancers that were diagnosed? Cancers such as ovarian cancer, or male breast cancer, or pancreatic cancers. We also wonder about hereditary influences when a person has developed multiple cancers, meaning that person had more than one within their own lifetime. We also wonder when there are family histories with similar or related cancers occurring together. That might be families where we see breast and ovarian cancers, or things like breast and thyroid and uterine cancers happening together. And so let's think about this with some examples in mind. This diagram is what we call a pedigree. It represents a family history. We draw it out visually so that we can look for patterns and understand relationships through individuals. On here, squares represent men and circles represent women. So walking us through from the far left side, you can see a square representing a man, and he is attached by a horizontal line to a circle representing a woman, his wife. Down below them, you see a bracket containing their 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. All 5 of these individuals' shapes are completely clear, indicating that they have not ever had the disease for which we are tracking this family history. To the right of the woman, though, you can see that her sister is shaded in dark. And we have shaded her in because she was diagnosed with a breast cancer at age 70. As we look through the rest of the family history, you can see no other individuals are shaded. And so we go back to our list of questions for clues. Do we see any young cancers that were diagnosed? We don't. No one here was diagnosed with cancer before age 50. Do we see any rare cancers? Again, we don't. None from the list we reviewed. And the woman who had cancer had a single occurrence. She did not have cancer more than once. And so this family represents likely a sporadic cancer, meaning that these are not inherited and they are most likely to happen later on in life. In this scenario, most of the individuals here can pursue average cancer screening and average cancer prevention. Sometimes, though, we see family histories that aren't quite that straightforward. On this diagram on the right-hand side, you'll see that a woman is shaded in dark because she had breast cancer at age 85. Down below and to her left, her niece is shaded in because she had a breast cancer at age 60. And we go through our questions. Do we see any young cancers? We don't. Do we see any rare cancers? Not in this family. And no one was diagnosed with more than one cancer. But there were 2 individuals who have had the same cancers diagnosed. This pattern might be a little less clear. It could be that both of these women developed breast cancer through random chance alone. They may have also shared some environmental risk factors that we haven't captured through drawing this diagram, or perhaps there's something about genetics we don't fully understand. At its root, though, we can know that this family is unlikely to have a single hereditary risk factor. It's unlikely that there is one gene difference being passed along, significantly elevating risk. Sometimes, though, we see family histories that look like this. In the middle row here, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 women who are all shaded in, 4 women, sisters, who all had breast cancers. And you can see as well that 3 of the 4 of them were diagnosed before age 50. In turn, their daughters and nieces also have individuals who are shaded in down below them, and their breast cancers happened at quite young ages. As we work through the questions here, we note that there are a number of young diagnoses. There are also lots of individuals who've had the same or related types of cancer. There might not be any rare cancers, and there are no notes here of an individual who had more than one cancer, but this suggests to me that there might be a hereditary risk factor. In about 5 to 10% of all cancers, we see these younger than typical ages of onset or combinations that make us say, there might be one gene difference that we should pay attention to. And so this type of family history makes us think about the option of a genetic test. As we consider genetic testing, individuals have to make decisions that are right for themselves. And so we have to evaluate, why would we want to know about genetic information? Why would we want to know about genetic risk? For some of us, that may be because we are currently treating a cancer. And some cancer treatments can be impacted by our genetic makeup. Some pharmacologic drugs, such as chemotherapies, can be selected based upon the genes that we were born with and the genes of our tumor, so that we're choosing those that are going to be most effective. For some of us, though, we're using this information to know more about risk. Do I have a risk to develop a cancer or maybe another cancer? Do my children have these risks? Are there other family members that I should be informing? And the focus of risk is really on thinking proactively about cancer screening and cancer prevention. Our goal is always to screen and try and find cancer if it happens as early as possible, because the earlier we find cancer, the more effectively we can treat it. So by knowing about these risk factors, we can offer these tools that have the potential to be life-saving. Diving just a little bit deeper onto treatment impacts, you can see there are 4 articles here that describe several very new developments in the way we treat cancers. There are classes of medications called PARP inhibitors, which are chemotherapy drugs that are thought to only be effective for individuals who carry gene mutations in BRCA1 and BRCA2. So genetic information for those individuals can help us decide if that drug therapy is something that should be applied. We also see those types of drug developments for other genetic differences. The last article on this list discusses something called Lynch syndrome, which can be associated with risks of colon and uterine cancer, and so affecting those cancers through pharmacologic treatment best. Lastly, you see an article about cancer screening for some more rare cancers, such as pancreatic cancers. Pancreatic cancer, as we all know, is a cancer that is very hard to detect early, and so there has been ongoing research to determine appropriate screening tools. Individuals who have genetic predispositions for cancer, like pancreatic cancer, may consider exploring some of our new or our research-based screening protocols in order to be as proactive as possible. So this information has the potential to impact our immediate decision-making for some individuals. Now, when I started talking about genetics and cancer, some of us thought about Angelina Jolie. She is probably the most famous person who has shared with us her genetic information. She has come to the public and shared that she carries a mutation in BRCA1, and that gene significantly raises her risk to develop breast and ovarian cancers. And by knowing this information and working closely with her care team, she chose to lower her risk through preventative surgeries. She underwent a bilateral mastectomy. She removed both of her breasts, though neither had ever had cancer. And she also chose to remove her ovaries, though they were also cancer-free. By pursuing these surgeries, she significantly reduced the likelihood that cancer would occur because less tissue is less opportunity for cancer development. Not every individual who carries a mutation in BRCA1 or 2 will choose these types of surgeries. Many will choose to increase their screenings, such as thinking about something like a breast MRI in addition to their breast mammograms. I want to emphasize there are lots of options. There are lots of options for cancer screening, and there are lots of options for cancer prevention. And there is not a one-size-fits-all answer, even for those who carry genetic differences. The goal, though, again, is to be proactive and to try and prevent cancers, or to screen better for cancers if they might happen. So here is a pedigree, a family history, that is a variation on a family I saw a few years ago. At the very bottom of the screen, you see a circle that represents a woman who came to the office at age 31. She presented and wanted to talk about genetic testing for a risk of hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome. When we reviewed her family history, we took the information that you can see above. Shaded in as a square shape is her father, who was diagnosed with a breast cancer in his mid-50s. Taking another step back, his parents, her grandparents, are shaded in clear, meaning that they have neither had a cancer. This man, though, did have a maternal grandmother with history of colon cancer and a paternal aunt who also had a cancer in her lifetime. When we talked to this young woman about her family history, it certainly raised the interest in thinking about hereditary cancer risk. After all, she has one of those suspicious and rare diagnoses, a male breast cancer that has happened in her family history. But we didn't want to begin by doing genetic testing for her. Can you guess why? Some of you have thought of it. We are thinking instead about her father. And the reason we're thinking about him, I think, is well visualized through this image. On the left-hand side, you can see a tree that is producing all red apples. And at the base, we understand this tree's genes tell it to make red apples. And that's what we would always expect to see from it. But on the right-hand side, you can see this tree suddenly produced one yellow apple. And we would ask ourselves, if we approached this tree, why in the world is that apple yellow? And we could gather all kinds of information about this tree. We could look at its trunk, we could taste its red apples, we could measure the leaves, count them up. But we won't understand why that apple was yellow without asking the yellow apple. We would have to analyze it to understand what was different in order to explain what occurred. And so for this family that we met, we wanted to think about the gentleman who was the yellow apple, the gentleman who had that rare breast cancer. Because if anyone in a family is likely to have a genetic disposition for cancer, a person with one of those rare diagnoses is most likely to be the person. And so we were able to talk with her father. He did elect to pursue genetic testing, and we discovered that just like Angelina Jolie, he carried a mutation in BRCA1. That was very useful information for this family, because then we were able to test his daughter, and we were able to test her specifically for the mutation we knew she was at risk for. By doing that testing, it gave us a definitive yes or no. Did she inherit that risk factor from her father? Or did she not inherit a risk factor and instead should be treated as any other young woman her age? In addition to giving us that very clear-cut answer, it has the potential to save a little money, because a single gene test, like she pursued, is actually a little less expensive than the larger test that would have been pursued if we hadn't had that knowledge. Even more important than cost, though, knowing exactly what she could plan to do before we ever did the testing was the most important part. She knew what to anticipate before the information was ever received. And so, when we search for something rare, like in genetics, I always hope that we can start the search with the most likely target. Now, we've talked a lot about BRCA1. So let's spend a minute and dive a little deeper into BRCA1 and BRCA2. These are genes that every single person has. And what they are doing for us is a process that's called tumor suppression. They build a protein that helps to regulate how fast our cells grow and divide. And when they help to regulate the cells correctly, they make sure that cells grow at a predictable rate. And when cells grow at a predictable rate, they behave in a way that is also predictable. And they are less likely to grow abnormally and less likely to turn into a cancer. When a person has a mutation in this gene, though, they make a protein that cannot regulate that cell division as effectively as it should. And if cell division gets out of control, a cell has the potential to turn into cancer simply because it's growing and dividing in a way that's different from all the cells around it. So people who are born with mutations in genes like these are at higher than average risk of cancer in the parts of our body where they should have been regulating cell division, and they can't do that work. When we look at those risks, we always want to do that from a relative perspective. So what you see on this image is blue bars that represent the risk in the general population for cancer to occur. So within our lifetimes, the likelihood that a person could develop a breast cancer before age 70 is about 8%. That's that second blue column on the left-hand side. When someone has a mutation in BRCA1 or 2, though, their risks are much higher because their cell division isn't working in the same way. And so individuals with mutations in those genes can have risks that are approaching 85%, a very significant increase. If you look through the list, you can see that BRCA1 and 2 are specifically related to increases in risk of breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and prostate cancer. BRCA2 has also been associated with risk of pancreatic cancer and risk of melanoma. The reason we want to know these risks and know what the risks are compared to everyone else is so that we can make proactive decisions about how to screen and prevent for cancers. As you remember, we said that some women with BRCA1 mutations will think about adding a breast MRI to their breast mammogram schedule, increasing screening so that if something happens, we catch it early when cancer is most treatable. We also have the potential to think about prevention, like Angelina Jolie did. When she pursued her mastectomy, removal of her breast tissue, she lowered the chances that she would develop breast cancer by more than 90%. For her, that risk reduction was the right choice. Now, BRCA1 and BRCA2 are probably the most well-known hereditary cancer genes, but they're also not the only ones. There are actually lots of genes that have been discovered with relationships to cancer. And so when we pursue genetic testing today, we pursue what's called a multi-gene panel, where we look at dozens of genes at the very same time. It has very similar cost and turnaround time to smaller tests, and it's got lots of benefits because it gives us more information, but it also has got some potential limitations. And this balance of benefit and limitation is something that should be carefully considered before genetic testing is ordered. There are several different laboratories out there that offer genetic testing, and cost can vary quite a bit. There are labs as expensive as $6,000 and some with costs as low as $250. If we're pursuing testing through insurance, some insurance companies want you to choose specific laboratory. And then once we've chosen the lab to use, we have to make a choice about which test to do in particular. We can actually choose anywhere from 100 to 140 genes, and every test is going to have its own pros and cons. As you can imagine, that's left genetic counselors like myself a little frustrated at times, but it also leaves us a really unique opportunity to choose the right test that is the right choice for every individual person. We can really tailor what we're seeking to align with the information that would be most beneficial for that patient. Now you can imagine as well, when we do a test that is this big, there can be such a thing as too much information. So when we think about that long list of genes that are available, we want to understand that some genes may not have cancer risks that are that high. So we want to ponder for a little while, is a test something we want to do for genes that have more moderate risks? We also know that we don't know everything in genetics. Our knowledge is growing and evolving. And so there are some genes that we have discovered where cancer risks are not quite as well known. We also know that there are probably genes we have not discovered that we cannot look at yet today. And so these are limitations to keep in mind before we order a test. Now, I mentioned it briefly, but I want to highlight again. Breast and ovarian cancers are not the only cancers that have genetic risks. There can be hereditary links to cancers like colon cancer, uterine cancer, pancreatic cancer, and others. So if you feel like your family or personal history meets some of those things that we talked about, I encourage you to start the conversations. Reach out, speak to your families. Reach out, speak with your providers to determine, is genetics something that we need to be considering? As you start those conversations, there are a few things that you can do. The first one is know your family history, and the second one is to share your family history. By knowing and sharing and swapping information with your relatives, you can all ensure that you are seeking the most appropriate care. If we don't know information, we can't make informed decisions with it in mind. So share as much as you're comfortable. And then with that armed information, reach out and have a candid conversation. Any of your health professionals would be happy to talk this through with you, and you could always consider reaching out or seeking an appointment with a genetic counselor. If genetic counseling is something that you're interested in, you can go to this website, www.aboutgeneticcounselors.com. What you'll see when you log in there is a screen that looks like this. It shares with you a little bit more about who genetic counselors are, how you find one, and what in the world they do. But if you click on the tab that says Help Me, you'll be taken to one of several pages. This page in particular has an entire list of family history resources, ways that you can gather the information, things that you should make sure to know, like how old someone was when they had their cancer and what type of cancer it was that they had to begin with. If you're not sure how to gather this information, I think this resource is a very valuable one. Now, if all of the information that we have talked about today has raised your interest in genetics, or you're wondering if you might have hereditary risk of cancer, do a little elbow work, do a little elbow grease work. Find all this information to the best of your ability, talk it over with your providers, and see if something like a genetics appointment would be right for you. After all, sharing this information and thinking about our risks uniquely is going to be our best opportunity to reduce our risk by pursuing appropriate cancer screening. Thank you so much for your time and for your attention today.